And don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Bow, 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 bow.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice and peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support us here at Freedom Now through this latest season of Fund Drive. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, February 24th, 2024. We begin with author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne. He'll be joined on the line by Kerry O. Polk, associate professor of Black Studies and Sexuality, Women's and Gender Studies at Amherst College in Massachusetts. For our purposes today, he's the author of the book Contagions of Empire: Scientific Racism, Sexuality, and Black Military Workers Abroad, 1898 to 1948. Then, in the second half of our program, we'll be hearing from Edward González-Tennant, assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas in Rio Grande Valley. Professor González-Tennant is also author of the book The Rosewood Massacre, an Archaeology and History of Intersectional Violence. It'll be another informative and enlightening morning for you listeners right here on KPFK. Now, while we are in Fund Drive and still are able to bring you this much quality content, we want to remind you to call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org and pledge your support to the station at any level. Remember, these are all tax-deductible donations, and you can even take home one of our fantastic premiums from the Library of Dr. Gerald Horne, available for your donation of $100 or more. So pick up the phone right now and give what you can by dialing 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Make your pledge and support for our efforts here at Freedom Now felt and seen. Of course, I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Ebo Taylor, John Coltrane, Donald Byrd, Larry Coryell, Nicholas Payton, and Herbie Hancock. Now, people, get ready for this trainer coming, taking you one step closer to mental liberation. And stay tuned for a conversation with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Khary O. Polk.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Khary O. Polk, Associate Professor of Black Studies and Sexuality, Women's and Gender Studies at Amherst College in Massachusetts, and author of the book Contagions of Empire, Scientific Racism, Sexuality, and Black Military Workers Abroad, 1898 to 1948. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Polk.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
And it's great to have you. So why did you write this book, Contagions of Empire?
I think I wanted to think through a little bit of my own personal history as the son of an African-American military family, and thinking about how often we moved around the world during my father's career, and that really is myself and my mother and my brother and sister. But also, I wanted to get a sense of what the movement, the long history movement of Black people around the world, what it said about Black people's engagement with American militarism, and thinking through the rationales of why Black folks continued to serve, specifically serving a country that was not interested in giving full right to citizenship. These are questions, I think, that have needled me since my time as a child. And while I didn't become a soldier like my father, I think that part of my investment in thinking through these histories is to think about the possibility of progressive and radical action within the military, or at least the Black folks who serve in the military, as not only being seen in one particular way. And so I wanted to think through these histories and in some ways try to tell a different story around Black military service. I think that there is a way in which there's an assumption that all the histories around Black people in the military have already been told. And in some ways, growing up, I think that I felt that was something that there was nothing new to find. But after doing archival research and finding leads that other scholars led me to, I think I found some things that I was shocked to discover. And so a lot of these ideas came together and helped me write this book.
So where abroad did you live?
I lived in the United Kingdom for 8 years and also Okinawa for 4 years. That's where I graduated high school. And before I was born, my parents were stationed in Spain. And so much of my own life was spent as a child of Black folks in the military, specifically enlisted Black folks. And so coming back to the United States was a little bit of a shock, just in terms of spending so much of my life outside of the United States. And then coming back, trying to, think about questions about race and Blackness and politics. And so that's been been a wonderful, let's say, second or third journey for me, just in terms of being back in the States now for 2 decades. And so that's helped me think through my work as well.
So what was the role of the alleged immunity of Black people in terms of recruiting them for overseas missions, for example, in your book, in the Philippines Islands and in Cuba?
Well, it's really fascinating that that Black folks first, arguably, their first overseas service happened during the Spanish-Cuban American War in 1898, and then later on in the Philippines. And the idea is that the U.S. military knew that war in Cuba would be complicated by outbreaks of yellow fever. And in 1898, there was still a belief on the books that Black folks were immune to yellow fever or had higher rates of immunity than did white folks. And this was a complicated idea that was enshrined, through American slavery. And so this idea of Black people being immune was really connected to much of the care labor that Black women did in the South during yellow fever epidemics. And so a number of doctors and researchers, they doubled down on this idea. What's made this idea intriguing is that we can look at this and talk about how racist these ideas were. But these were also ideas that a number of Black leaders found useful in terms of allowing Black folks to serve in the U.S. military during this war. So specifically, I'm thinking about Booker T. Washington, who went all out and arguing that Black people were in fact immune to yellow fever, and therefore we should in fact embrace the opportunity to serve in this war and to demonstrate our patriotism. And a lot of this is the idea that if patriotic service is displayed on the battlefield, then rights and privileges of citizenship will be bestowed upon the greater Black community. And it comes through this notion, this term immunity is something that I found really fascinating, because immunity itself as a concept is also a term that was used in the 19th century as well, to really think about, to define rights and privileges of citizenship. And so that I found it really fascinating that these two notions of immunity were connected in this particular moment of overseas warfare.
You also discuss in your book, Professor Polk, recent Black military history in terms of the death in Niger in Africa of Sergeant LaDavid Johnson. What role does he play in your pages?
I think that LaDavid Johnson's tragic story is one in which it allows us to think about the continuities of Black service, and in some ways the idea of what does honor and sacrifice mean for the Black military subject in the United States. LaDavid Johnson was a young Black man who joined the U.S. military after being in basically an after-school program for Black and brown young men. And by all accounts, he was a wonderful soldier, a wonderful father. And he was killed in Niger. And when he was killed, it created a small media sensation in terms of how he was killed, and the fact that there was so little information. It led to lots of speculation that perhaps he had betrayed his unit. His Blackness gave a way to claims of perhaps that he had some Muslim sensibilities, or there were ways in which his character became assaulted in the media. And there was also a famous quote of then President Trump saying something to the effect to his bereaved wife that he knew when he served, he knew what he was getting in to through his service. And so I think that for me, I was interested in using his more contemporary story as a lens through which we could actually think about this longer history of the questions around death and honor for Black folks. And even, wondering, even in death, are Black folks in the military bestowed a kind of honor, and what privileges of citizenship do they obtain through their notion of sacrifice. So I really, I found his story just infuriating, frustrating, and also I saw that it resonated with some of the other stories of sacrifice that I had begun to catalog through my research.
And of course, you connect the death of David Johnson in Niger in 2017 to AFRICOM, the Africa Command of the U.S. military, and the Special Operations Command in Africa, and the Special Operations Command Forward, North and West Africa, etc., which is conducting what you call, quote, shadow wars, unquote, in Africa.
Right.
And speaking of which, who was Charles Young, and why do you call him, quote, America's chief Black military imperialist, quote unquote?
Charles Young is really an amazing historical character. He was an amazing man. Charles Young was the first Black colonel in Army history, and he chose exile and death in Africa, I argue, rather than succumb to racism in the United States. One of the things that's amazing about Charles Young is that he was the third African American to graduate from West Point, and he also served as a military attaché in Haiti. And while in Haiti, he actually began to, I would say, quench his desire for more information around the Haitian Revolution, specifically his idol Toussaint Louverture. And one of the things that's amazing about Young is that much of the work that he did in Haiti was then used to help U.S. Marines to intervene, quote unquote, but to really to I'm sorry, this, if you can edit this part, I appreciate it. His time, a lot of what Charles Young did, which made him America's chief military imperialist, was to draft maps about the Haitian landscape, which were then used by the U.S. military to help take over the country. In addition, he created a dictionary, one of the first Haitian Creole English dictionaries ever, and he began work during his time in Haiti, drafting a play about Toussaint Louverture, which he worked on for the rest of his life. And in many ways, it's probably the first, I would say, American or African-American play written about Toussaint. And in many ways, the final version of it has been lost to history. But being able to look at a version that he wrote in 1910 allows us to get a sense of the contradictions that he was experiencing as an African-American officer. He really wanted to be like Toussaint. And some of Toussaint's his own contradictions seem to play out in Charles Young's life as well. And so Charles' life, just in a similar way in which Toussaint died in France, I begin to make an argument that Young chose to die in Africa because, of course, he had been in Africa doing some of the same work he had done in Haiti. He'd been in Liberia. Then he was also collecting information in Nigeria, where he died. And so he is a complicated, I would say, Pan-African militarist in terms of his belief in that African people should be engaged in the art and theory of warfare. But at the same time, he was very much an American and proud of that. And so he represents, I would say, a lot of the contradictions that today I think that we may have collectively about what it means for African Americans to serve in the U.S. military.
So why was there apprehension by the U.S. authorities concerning relationships between African American soldiers in the Philippines Islands and Filipinas? And what kind of propaganda was used to discourage these kinds of relationships?
Well, I think that there was just a sense that there was a fear that African Americans would have closer sympathies with Filipinos and Filipinas than they would with the white soldiers and officers who they were serving alongside. The other side of this, or I'd say the broader story, is that, of course, that the white soldiers and officers were exporting Jim Crow to the Philippines. And so the idea of Black folks becoming comrades with Filipinos was seen as a problem. And there was also fear of, let's say, the kind of, the closer ties, kind of the tenderest of ties, I think, that some of the folks say on the ground in terms of African American men having intimate relations with Filipinos and Filipinas and around marriage and sex and sexuality. And so this was one of the rationales that the U.S. military had, or one of their frustrations, that they thought that wherever Black folks were stationed, they managed to make friends. And I think that that's one of the things that I find really fascinating about the movement of African American soldiers and nurses around the 20th century, is that you begin to see a cultural movement. That when Black folks move, and African Americans move, there's a cultural shift that occurs alongside their movement, and that itself helps to destabilize notions of race and class wherever they were stationed.
So, what kinds of medical experiments were conducted on Black male soldiers?
This is probably the most intriguing part of the research for me, and also some of the most harrowing. And it's connected to the notion of Black soldiers and their intimate relationships with so-called foreign women, specifically white women in France during World War I. There were American doctors, American urologists from Johns Hopkins, who became part of the war effort, and their greatest fear during World War I was that the U.S. military would be beset by large amounts of sexually transmitted infections and diseases, or venereal diseases, VD, during the language of the day. And so because of that, they adopted a practice known as chemical prophylaxis. And prophylaxis is a term that we've probably heard today, especially on commercials discussing pre-exposure prophylaxis, specifically taking a 1 pill a day that will stop someone becoming infected with HIV. The idea around PrEP itself is over 100 years old. And so chemical prophylaxis was a form of PrEP or PEP in this instance. The idea was that if you had a sexual encounter with someone and you think that perhaps you were exposed to a disease, that you were supposed to have silver compounds injected into your urethra, held for 5 minutes before letting it pass, and then mercury chloride applied on your genitalia exteriorly afterwards. Now, initially, this was supposed to be an elective or a procedure that you chose to do. But in the case of Black soldiers in port cities around France, the white military medical officials did not want Black soldiers interacting with white women and white French women. And so for these soldiers, these stevedores, there are cases where every time they left their bases and went outside into town, there was an assumption that treatment administered to them whenever they left the base. And for me, this becomes a instance of systemized torture of Black male bodies, and the fear of Black genitalia and the fear of Black sexual agency is something I did not expect to find, especially by thinking of. But this is something that I'd say I was shocked that specifically that the doctor who oversaw this entire treatment was Hugh Hampton Young. And Hugh Hampton Young is today known as the father of the American father of urology. And so the idea that Hugh Hampton Young was able to experiment on Black male genitalia is just connected to other moments of experimentation of Black women in the 19th century, and it's very eerie. It's eerie, these kinds of parallels that have occurred. And honestly, I would say that part of my own frustration as a professor, as a writer, as a researcher, is the fact that why didn't someone tell me about this? Why didn't I find out that someone else was also involved in a kind of torture of Black bodies? And I feel that once I begin to learn, one thing, there's so much more to learn. And so just thinking about Hugh Hampton Young in the same way that we continue to think about J. Marion Sims, who's seen as the father of modern gynecology, that these two fathers of modern gynecology and modern urology, I think, really need to be held up together, and we need to reflect upon them as, I would say, as a nation, as a people, as people who are really thinking broadly and intimately about the kind of violations that can happen through institutions like the U.S. military.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Polk, Associate Professor of Black Studies and Sexuality, Women and Gender Studies at Amherst College in Massachusetts, and author of the book, Contagions of Empire. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
Special thanks to Professor Polk for sharing his hard-earned knowledge with us. Where else can you get such quality content, context, and historical perspective other than Freedom Now? Call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate and support the show today. And you'll be able to take home one of our awesome premiums to expand your library and your mind. Dr. Horne, tell the people a little bit about what they can take home today.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne coming to you with a question. Have you wondered how and why it is that it was South Africa that dragged Israel before the International Court of Justice in The Hague on charges of violating the Genocide Convention in historic Palestine? Have you wondered how and why it is that it is South Africa that now has charged the United States and UK with aiding and abetting the genocidaires in Israel, which opens the door for pressuring Washington to improve its own horrible human rights record when it comes to restraining police terror right here in Los Angeles? Well, wonder no more. For a pledge of a mere $100, you can receive a signed copy of my book, White Supremacy Confronted, U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa from Rhodes to Mandela. In this massive book, you will also find out why the Palestine Solidarity Movement needs to pattern itself after the anti-apartheid movement, which culminated with the downfall of this system by 1994 and the election of Nelson Mandela. In this book, you will also find out how the anti-apartheid movement pressured universities to divest their endowments from holding stock in corporations invested in apartheid South Africa, a maneuver that now the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement targeting Israel is seeking to emulate. In this book, you will also find out how the anti-apartheid movement launched a cultural boycott, pressuring artists and musicians in particular to boycott South Africa and picketing and protesting those who cross this picket line. In this book, you will also find out how the anti-apartheid movement sought to expel South Africa from the United Nations, isolated diplomatically, which the Palestine Solidarity Movement must contemplate if Israel chooses to ignore the International Court of Justice mandate. In this book, you will also find out how the anti-apartheid movement made South Africa an issue in presidential elections, and thus we were able to pass congressional legislation over the veto of President Ronald Reagan, and likewise pass municipal and statewide legislation, which the Palestine Solidarity Movement will have to contemplate if Israel remains as obdurate tomorrow as it is today. Pledge $100 and receive a signed copy of this book that provides a roadmap for the Palestine Solidarity Movement. But wait, there's more. Pledge $150 and receive the anti-apartheid book and a signed copy of the book by Gerald Horne entitled Paul Robeson, The Artist as Revolutionary, a riveting story of the man who was admired by Nelson Mandela, who kept a picture of him on his wall at home, the man who launched the first anti-apartheid movement, this after jeopardizing his career as Hollywood's first black star, and who paid a stiff price as a result. Robeson was also a star footballer and linguist, an attorney as well, a role model for today's youth. What a bargain! Pledge $100 and receive a signed copy of the anti-apartheid book. Pledge $100 and receive a signed copy of the Robeson biography. Or pledge a mere $150 and receive a signed copy of both books, a statement and testament to the idea that Palestine will be free, and so will we. Visit our secure website at kpfk.org or pick up the phone and dial
818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate right now and make your support for the show and the station felt. Now, we're going to keep this train moving and send you back off to Dr. Gerald Horne, who's being joined on the line by author and Professor Edward González-Tennant, right here on Freedom Now.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now. And with me on the line is Edward González-Tennant, Assistant Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas in Rio Grande Valley, and author of the book, The Rosewood Massacre, an Archaeology and History of Intersectional Violence. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, Professor González-Tennant.
Thank you for having me.
We're happy to have you. So why did you write this book, The Rosewood Massacre?
So for, I guess, a few different reasons. I first started researching Rosewood as a graduate student. I did my PhD at the University of Florida, so that's Gainesville, Florida. Rosewood is located actually very close to Gainesville, maybe less than an hour away. And I had a number of interests, both academically, I guess professionally, and personally. And those dealt with things like social justice and education. Also have sort of a past life as a social activist working with anti-war efforts in US, New Zealand, and elsewhere. So I sort of saw Rosewood as a way to academically tie together, interests that for some people seem disparate, but for me, and I was lucky to engage with scholars who agreed that these interests should actually be combined. So as I started looking into Rosewood, I quickly realized, and it surprised me, that nobody at the University of Florida, which, is a very large university, and certainly at the time was the largest in the state of Florida, nobody had written a master's thesis or a PhD dissertation on the topic of Rosewood. So I saw that as a huge, empty spot in the historical record. And it sort of mirrors the fact that Rosewood, was erased from historical memory and remains sort of an unknown, or at least underknown, chapter in Florida and American history. And so, I come from a background as an archaeologist. So I thought, how can archaeology explore something like a race riot or a race massacre? And began talking to descendants and survivors, their allies, and various other folks who were interested in these topics. And over the next 4, 5, 6 years, put together a project in Rosewood that used archaeology, history, oral history, and a whole lot of different data sets to try to really answer maybe some related questions, but a really big one for me was, how does something like Rosewood, which this year is an event that took place just over a century ago, how does something like that, the destruction of a Black town, resonate across time and space? Why does it matter in the present? And of course, studying these things in the 2000s, 2010, and into the 2010s and teens, I couldn't necessarily have predicted just how much these sorts of events were going to resonate in the present with all sorts of movements, social, political, and educational movements that have sort of emerged in the last decade. And so the reason I wrote the book was, on the one hand, to show that archaeology, which is not something people necessarily think of as a discipline exploring the recent past, actually has a lot to offer. But also to try to answer this question, how does something like a race riot, a race massacre, a collective form of in this case, African-American violence, how does an event like that a century ago echo across time and space? And of course, in some ways, it echoes across time and space because the descendants and the families are alive and they still live with intergenerational trauma, the loss of intergenerational wealth. But it also speaks to much larger systemic and structural things that have continued across that century in American society and politics, and how we write about the past and what chapters become important. And, so sort of addressing those things, I saw Rosewood as a place where I could combine these interests, do a service for descendants, and try to make a connection between the past and the present.
So precisely, what triggered this massacre of Black people in Rosewood, Florida, approximately a century ago? how many people, for example, were killed?
So, I think like a lot of large-scale events, the reasons for this are nuanced and complex, on the face of it. And certainly if you look at maybe previous treatments of race riots and lynching studies in general, you might see some people defer to this idea of the madness of crowds, or that, a trigger event. And in this case, that trigger event would be, a white woman in a neighboring community claims she's been assaulted by an African-American male. That triggering event sort of incenses the local white populace, who eventually lose control because they become, a crowd of sort of chaotic, unthinking actors who that sort of an analysis also kind of absolves them of any kind of responsibility. And, I think the truth is much more complex than that. I think it has to do with how large parts of white America viewed themselves in relation to other minority communities, and in the American South, that would obviously be African Americans. So you have things like a burgeoning eugenics movement that tries to tell poor whites that they're at least genetically superior to African Americans, even if they're not economically better off. You have structural things taking place following World War I, where African Americans return from the war and have been fighting for democracy, only to return and not have that. So they're beginning to agitate for really basic rights that have been guaranteed to them for generations at this point. So you have these things at national and regional levels, and then at a very local level between, a white, or at least majority white company town, Sumner, the neighboring community in Rosewood, and then, Rosewood, a majority African-American town. African Americans in Rosewood own property at rates higher than locally or regionally or even nationwide. They're investing in businesses, they're investing in education. And then you have a community of whites who are sort of being told that they're superior, are believing they're superior, and yet the sort of everyday experience for them is they live in a company town. They don't own their homes. They don't own businesses. They work for the, quote unquote, the man. They owe the company store. All of these sort of tropes we're familiar with. And this trigger event is sort of, I think, a moment where a large population of local whites, and then eventually non-local whites, sort of use that as an excuse to then visit violence upon a community that they feel, and this is somewhat conjecture, I can't read their minds, but I think it tracks with a lot of what we know about the time period. They feel that it's unfair that this Black community has what it has. Not that they're wealthy, but you own your own home, you own a small business that might be seen as doing better than somebody who works for a company store. And so I think that that's the setting that when this white woman fabricates a Black assailant to hide injuries she sustained from a white assailant, who she may or may not be involved with romantically outside of her marriage. I think that it's kind of that perfect storm of prejudice and racism as like a structural set of inequalities that is primed, and that all collapses in on Rosewood over that first week of 1923.
So how many people were killed?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So, in terms of numbers, it's, I guess, relatively small. You have 6 confirmed African Americans who were killed during that week. And then you have at least 2 white folks who are injured attempting to break into a Black home. They don't die there. They actually die later of their injuries. So official accounts still remain at 6 Black and 2 white victims. But of course, then the larger aspect of this is that every African American in Rosewood was violently displaced from the town. All of their buildings and possessions burned, and largely, really none of them ever returned to Rosewood.
Now, we know that the late Black Los Angeles filmmaker John Singleton did a Hollywood film called Rosewood some years ago. What's your opinion of that movie?
I mean, I guess I am probably like many people, and some of this is based on talking to descendants from Rosewood. I'm of kind of two minds about the film. I mean, on the one hand, it's an important film because it brings recognition. And while it may not have been commercially an enormous success, for a lot of people, if they've heard of Rosewood, it's because they've seen or heard of that film. So in terms of, you know, getting the story, as it were, out to a larger group of people, I think it's important, and efforts like that are really important. On the other hand, as with any Hollywood film, it takes certain artistic licenses. You know, the opening scene shows a white man having an extramarital affair with a black woman. Of course, the descendants of that African-American woman, you know, are not overly joyed that this is how an ancestor is represented. In the film ends with a depiction of a large sort of mass burial, which, you know, this is an aspect of Rosewood, like a lot of places, that persists even though a lot of effort has been expended and no mass grave has ever been located, even though Rosewood in some ways is one of the more researched sites. But, you know, I would say that's kind of the twin feelings I have. On the one hand, I wish more films about these sorts of events were made, but I wish that they relied more on historical fact than artistic license.
What about the role of gender? What role does it play in your pages?
So, you know, my book and the analysis is sort of informed by intersectionality theory, and so I'm very interested in looking at the intersection of class and race and gender, and I'm, you know, also interested in how that works as a sort of metaphor, if you will, for the different types of violence. So in terms of Rosewood, and I would say that this probably doesn't come through in the book as much as it should, but one of the roles in thinking along the lines of gender would be really who kept the story of Rosewood alive. And for those folks who are either African American or familiar with African American history, you know, there's often a large responsibility of women, particularly maintaining sorts of stories and oral histories and really oral traditions that are important to the community. And that's certainly the case in Rosewood. While you have both men and women who are active in descendant communities, I would say, and again, you know, this has not been like an overly theorized aspect of what I've published on, but it's certainly, I think, clear when you talk to the folks who are doing a lot of the work in Rosewood, a lot of the memory and commemoration work, they tend to be African American women. And certainly the survivors and many of the descendants who I worked with, who I interviewed, their oral histories informed, you know, my own analysis. They were all women. And so I would say that in terms of gender, you know, understanding the gender differences, and this speaks to a much larger array, right, of structural things in American society, particularly things like, right, unfair, unequal amounts of incarceration against African American men, right? The African American family is besieged by pressures and challenges that many other American families, particularly white ones, don't face or understand or, right, quite frankly, are even aware of. So, you know, in Rosewood, it's become very important, the role of gender in just keeping the story, the knowledge, that history alive, not just into the present, but I would say that it's you know, African American women have become the central players in maintaining and even promoting that story for future generations.
What about reparations? Were they accorded to the survivors and descendants?
So, you know, Rosewood, yes, is an interesting case study because in the 90s, there was a state legislative move to award compensation to survivors and descendants of Rosewood. And in fact, the first historical study of Rosewood is actually commissioned And so a group of historians led by Dr. Maxine Jones, who's a professor of history at Florida A&M in Tallahassee, where she still teaches, they put together in a remarkably short period of time, 4 months, a really complete history of the 1923 event in Rosewood. And in fact, in 15 plus years of doing my own research, I've never found anything to contradict their findings. I think it's a remarkable piece of historical scholarship. But that was commissioned by the state as part of a series of hearings to determine if the state was culpable for any of the damages in Rosewood. And so the reasoning by lawyers was, if a high Department of Transportation truck is hauling signs, one becomes dislodged and decapitates a motorcyclist, the family of that motorcyclist has a legal ability to ask for compensation from the state. And so, lawmakers in Florida dodged the conversation about reparations, used the conversation about compensation, and then did, to the tune of millions of dollars, pay out compensation awards to survivors and descendants. Now, some of those amounts were almost insulting. You had some people get checks for like $11, $25. Others, like the survivors, got much larger settlements. But again, at that point, making up for 70 years of lost intergenerational wealth, it was just a drop in the bucket. And so, Rosewood has become, regardless of how the state of Florida tried to frame it, Rosewood has become a very important case study for, sort of post-emancipation, and really Jim Crow type of reparations. And, a lot of reparations talks about slavery, which is appropriate. I think that conversation needs to continue. But also during Jim Crow, a lot of Black property, a lot of Black wealth was violently removed from their hands and the hands of those communities. And I think we have less of a conversation about that kind of reparations, but Rosewood is an important case study in why we need to have a larger conversation.
Finally, Professor González-Tennant, author of the book, The Rosewood Massacre, how would you compare what you've written about with analogous events? For example, the so-called Tulsa Massacre that takes place around the same time, for example.
So, yes, the sad thing, and I'm not even, when I start this research 15, 16, 17 plus years ago, I'm not aware of the extent to which events like Rosewood occurred in the United States of America. Of course, what I know now, and I think growing numbers of citizens know now, is these events were unfortunately actually very common. And I focused on the post-World War I period because I was very interested. This is a time where, it's not the first time, but it's a time where African Americans have served internationally in the U.S. military and come back and have, basically started agitating and asking for the rights we're supposedly fighting for. Where are they? And, the economic situation and the post-war growth and a lot of other things sort of put this 5-year period in a really interesting moment, I think, in American history. And there's dozens, hundreds of these sorts of events. And you can sort of differentiate them. Is it a lynching where a group of people, sort of extra legally kill one or a handful of people? Or is it this larger sort of massacre, or what people have often referred to as race riots, where entire communities, white communities, organize against minority communities, and that can include murder, property destruction, right? For instance, in 1921 in Tulsa, you get 40 blocks or more of Greenwood, which are burned to the ground. And so, what I think occurs to me now, and certainly as I was doing the research, is kind of what I was mentioning before, the idea that, this is a huge national level, like slow event, slow violence that flares up time and time again. Rosewood is unique in some ways. It's a rural location, right? Most of these large race riots or race massacres actually take place in urban contexts, although not all. Many of them take place in Western and Northern contexts. So in the South, there's sort of a tradition of lynching, right? And we sort of define that as extra legal murders of one or a handful of people. And then race riots or race massacres, which are the sort of larger communal events. Those larger communal events tend to take shape or place outside of the American South, where in the American South, I mean, quite frankly, a tradition of lynching had emerged following following the Civil War, and had really reached its apex by the 1890s. And so you see different kinds of violence, and they're sort of supported and mobilized in different ways. And you have different economic and political and law enforcement structures emerge in different parts of the country to support those different kinds of violence. So, on the one hand, Rosewood is part of a much larger history that we have done, quite frankly, a very poor job of documenting. So there's a lot of work to be done. But on the other hand, it does offer some unique insights because the setting, both in terms of the region, but also the very local setting, is unique in many ways. And so I think, like a lot of these episodes of racial violence, there are important things that remind us to look at something nationally, but also very important things that we have to think about locally.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor. I appreciate your joining us, and thank you once again for sharing your wisdom on Freedom Now, KPFK Radio, Los Angeles.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guest, Professor Khary O. Polk from Amherst College in Massachusetts, as well as Professor Edward González-Tennant from the University of Texas in Rio Grande Valley, for joining us on the show today. Find that Black-owned bookstore you know and love and get their books right now. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder Baba Didan Kamati. Shout out to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our listeners and supporters out there. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. Please continue to support our programming. We are volunteer producers, and the station needs your help to help pay the bills and keep the lights on in the building. So please dial 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate and support the show. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org, or even go online to our audio archives at KPFK. Scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.